Is there such thing as tradition, oh not tradition, but generational trauma? Is there such thing? Is there such thing called, do we as human beings carry, like, yeah, traumas of generational traumas? I don't know how you would, yeah. And what does that even mean?
Well, I think there are two things. First, there is somehow the word generation needs to be defined.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other, I think trauma needs to be defined.
Okay.
I think at this moment, the best way I can kind of describe generation is that um, if you happen to be Caucasian, if you happen to be white, you carry on your shoulders the burden of all the things that people like you have done. Okay? If, for example, you are a white American and you go to the Middle East, let's just say Iraq or Afghanistan, you may be 18. You may have had nothing to do with the politics of the past century or so. You certainly had no hand in creating the map of the world in the 1900s. And yet, because of your skin color, in some ways, you're going to be judged and tried and most likely found guilty. Okay. If you happen to be black, if you go to Safeway, for example, your history is going to come back to haunt you. You may have nothing to do with the history, you know. You may be Colton in Prince of Bel-Air. You have come from a really, really good background. You have never suffered any poverty. And yet, because of who you are and what you are, someone in the store is going to follow you, make sure you're not stealing anything. Okay? If you're like me from the Middle East and you want to travel from point A to point B by air, they're going to pay special or close attention to me. I could be a potential terrorist because of what others have done who look like me. So all of us have no choice but to carry a burden. If you happen to be a woman who has been in, say, 2, 3, 4, 5 abusive relationships, the next time you go out on a date, you're going to categorize that man, whether you want to or not. It's going to happen. You're going to look at this man guilty the moment you say hello, because you know what he's capable of. You've already categorized him. Okay. If you happen to be a man who has gone through 2, 3 marriages, and with every divorce you have lost a good portion of your fortune, you're going to probably categorize women as gold diggers, that they're there to kind of mate with you for a while and then take your goods and run away. Okay. Trauma, you know, there's always going to be some disruption in life, always. No life is ever safe, and that's something all of us learn in the book of Job. You could be the best human being, but life doesn't care for those things. Life does what it does. Life creates, it destroys, and if you can survive it, fine. If you can't, well, too bad for you. Life has no pity for anyone. Okay. Um, you know, as a human being, what comes to you are experiences, and then how you process those experiences. Some have to do with your tradition, your culture. Some have to do with the people around you. Okay. Uh, there is a movie called Braveheart. Okay. And so Mel Gibson is the main character. He's a young boy. His father is going to the battlefield. He wants to go and join them, but the father says, no, you're far too young. You need to stay home and take care of your mom. And so they're a little delayed, the father is, from coming back from a meeting or a fight or something. And they go to this stable and they find the father, him and his, I think, neighbor or uncle or someone. And he sees his brothers and he sees his father hung from the ceiling, 15, 20 people. And his eyes are quickly covered, but he's already seen, what has happened. So, and there is a ritual, in this tradition, which is they're all covered with a thin fabric, linen cloth, and they are set off into the river, and the arrow with fire, is pointed at them, and they cremate the body. And then the next time you see Mel Gibson he's no longer 10 or 9, he is a grown man. He's like 25, 30. He has been taken by his uncle. Now, granted that this is a warrior culture, death is very normal. Losing a father or a mother is very normal. Not having your parents around, very normal. There are no cell phones. You can't slack off. You have to work from the moment you wake up in the morning to the time you go to bed. No one cares if you cry. No one cares if you whine. It's a culture that makes you responsible for yourself and other people at a very, very young age. You don't have the privilege of feeling that you're entitled to certain emotions, certain interpretations that excite emotions, that could be dangerous for yourself or for your community. Okay? So, while away with his uncle, apparently he had learned Latin, he had learned Greek, he had learned French, and he had become really good in the art of war. Okay? But there are several things at play that benefited Mel Gibson, at least the movie Braveheart, the character. First, you come from a warrior environment. You just know that today may be your last day. You may know, you probably expect that if your father goes to meet the King of France, there's a good chance that he's not going to come back. These are just known facts. It's kind of like the 1920s or 1930s, where no one lives over the age of 55, 60. It's just none, And so no one has to really worry about Alzheimer's. No one really has to worry about getting old and getting cancer. None of those things. You don't need nursing home, because by the time you want a nursing home, you're dead. You don't get that age. So you have an experience, and the experience happens to be unpleasant. And any experience that's unpleasant, the Messiah comes in, which is your thinking, your intellect. The intellect comes in and tries to figure out what has just happened. You know, why is your wife in a bad mood? Why is your husband in a bad mood? Why is it that you raise your hand in a classroom and the instructor doesn't call on you? You know, why is it that you're so excited to say something, but when you say what it is that you want to kind of say, everything comes out, you know, all jumbled up. And so you realize, in as much as you try to figure things out, you can't. So you seek advice. Okay. Now, there are a couple of things in seeking advice. Usually, when Yusuf goes to Sarah and asks for something, Sarah says no. Then Yusuf comes to me. He's a great politician at such a young age. And he knows that I'm a little softer. He knows that I'm much more forgiving than Sarah is. And so instead of, you know, Sarah giving him, for example, a tablespoon of Coke, I'll give him 24 pack. Okay, 24 cans of Coke, and he's really, really happy. So at a very young age, because feelings happen to be unpleasant, you need someone to encourage you, to make you feel that you have every right to feel the way you're feeling, you know. And you may not be completely aware of this, so you pick and choose, you know. If you go to someone and say, I just feel bad because my dad slapped me, and you're crying and you're in pain, you already know who the guilty party is. It's your father, okay? So you want someone to say, yes, it is your father who's the guilty party. And that encourages you, it supports you, and now you have a friend, okay? Now, what you want to do with that interpretation of the experience given to you by your friend is a different story. But that's what we do. We look for people who can support us in a conclusion we've already made. That my father hit me, all I was doing was just running around. Okay, so I broke the table. Okay, so the roof fell down. It's not my fault, you know, we're just having fun. When you have a certain narrative, certain story, certain perspective given to you over and over and over and over again, what you have is like that painting on the wall. You have a path that's created now for you. Every time you look at your father, you look at him as a guilty man. That now, you know, you can have unpleasant feelings towards your father. You cannot like your father, but when you begin to hate your father, that's a very, very different story, because hate has a branch in it that's called revenge. That you will do whatever you can to revenge what has been done to you. Okay. Now, when someone keeps telling the same story, it becomes the main filter. I mean, tonight we had coffee. I put in that filter about 10 scoops of coffee. It's a little strong tonight, okay? That filter ultimately decides how much water, how fast the water, okay, how strong or how weak the coffee will taste when it hits the pot, okay? Now, that is called trauma, where you have a filter through which you see the entire world. Okay. I don't know much about generational traumas. I mean, in some aspects, I think it makes sense when I'm a brown man from the Middle East, and when something nasty has happened to, say, New York 9/11, for example. If you happen to be a very self-aware African American and you have kind of seen what has been done to your people by the hands of white people, then yes, you find them guilty. If you happen to be white, for example, living in a neighborhood where there are African Americans, and it happens, and you happen to know a bit about their history, let's say about poverty, about drugs, various things, there's a good chance that you may find it very difficult to trust them, any of them. I mean, that's, all of us are guilty of that, you know. Now, if you're talking about an individual case, such as I hate my sister and I have a son, that depends on how you want to raise your kid. If you want your kid to follow in your footsteps, you know. I don't think generational traumas can exist for a single individual in relation to a tiny little episode that took place in their life, like 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. You know. I don't know, Lula. I don't know how people are made today. Everybody has problems. I don't know, how you can remedy, because it's, in some ways, it's a cultural phenomenon now. Somewhere in Afghanistan or somewhere in Iraq, you have fathers having, to some extent, physical relationships with their daughter. The same thing you can find in Afghanistan. It's been around for a long, long time. I mean, you have to understand incest, for example, something that Freud talked about and kind of categorizes as a taboo. Okay, you don't make something a taboo if it's not practiced often. You don't legislate a law if no one crosses boundaries. Okay, so you have a practice that's been around in human kind of life for a long, long time, and Freud just comes out and says, it's kind of something that we have done. We categorize it as an unpleasant experience, something that should not be done, so it becomes a taboo. Okay, so you have those taboos in practice in certain parts of the world. Women eventually, young girls become a woman and they go on to have, husband, they go on to have their own families, and they seem to be fine. I think when you have a lot of things at your disposal and they can come to you so easily, you naturally just grow a very, very, very soft skin, thin skin. You get hurt all the time, and you want to talk about your hurt. And that's really the best I can do in regards to what you've asked. All I know is that if there is trauma, it has a tendency of leaking everywhere in your life. No one is safe. If your next question is, well, how do you get rid of it? Is there a way to remedy it? I think there is always a way to remedy almost everything under the sun. It's just, it's very, very difficult because you're talking about alchemy, kind of transforming iron into gold. You're trying to kind of, first of all, have to figure out the location of the emotional pain, and then you have to figure out how you can go about fixing it. And even if you do have the remedy, the other person may not really be in the right place to be cured, Joseph Campbell, temperamentally, he's a very happy man. When you kind of watch him give lectures about mythology, and just when he talks about education and just human beings. His last lecture, his last interview, someone asked him if he was hopeful about human beings and civilization, all of that. And I think he was maybe 89, 90 then, if I'm not mistaken. He said, no, I don't really have much hope. All the good things that used to exist in human life, in human society, they've been gutted out, they've been destroyed, And so when you don't really have much of a foundation, And to some extent, that is what trauma does. You know, to be able to have friendships, you need trust. You know, and to have trust, you need, to some degree, faith. You know, you need to kind of have this feeling that, you know, the people that you know are not going to backstab you. You know, when you lose that particular foundation, you know, it doesn't matter how many times you hang out with anybody. That foundation is simply absent. You know, I had, and I've shared this story plenty of times. I had this friend from Afghanistan. Okay, so supposedly, and this is not to kind of dismiss or diminish, you know, what she experienced, but she was molested by her uncle when she was 9. Okay, so they come here from Afghanistan. She tells her parents, of course. Their parents say, no, it never happened, you're lying, all that stuff. And that's a big thing when you're so young, you know. And so she starts having boyfriends at the age of 13 or 14. You know, the innocent part of her had already been destroyed. She couldn't trust people, especially men. She's now about 40, 41, 42, perhaps a bit older. You know, she's a doctor. But, you know, she may be really good in that particular department, being a doctor, but outside of that profession, you know, there is nothing for her to do. There is no one that she can trust. Maybe she's, gotten some help, maybe she's better now, but that's all she has. She just goes to the hospital, works, and comes home. You know. And I suppose it's okay if you want to kind of make your profession, you know, a big part of your life. And instead of working 8 hours a day, you work 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day. You just come home and you collapse. You know, I think there are different people who can remedy different things in life. You know, I think if you were, for example, to go to Jesus and say, my relationship with my wife is not going well, I'm not really quite sure if he would kind of indulge you in that. He wouldn't say, well, you know, why don't you ask her what's wrong with her, and then sit back and just listen to her for 10 minutes. And then when she's done, tell her exactly what she said, so she knows that you understood her completely. Okay? And then state your position, and then ask her if she's understood. And then the two of you can kind of figure things out. You know, there may be people who can do that for you, you know, for people who kind of suffer from this particular issue. But I think if you were to go to Jesus and tell him that, he would say, listen, nothing down here survives. You know, I'm not really interested. You know, because remember what he tells the rich young man, go sell everything you have. And by everything, it doesn't mean that just the gold and the car. You got to sell your kids, and you got to sell your wife or your husband, and just come and follow me. He doesn't care for those things. And, you know, I think if you tackle or wrestle with the small questions of life, there is no end to the small questions. Am I straight or am I gay? Okay, so you're gay. Oh, fine. should I come out now or should I come out tomorrow? Okay, well, come out tomorrow. Okay. Well, my mom didn't like what I said to her about, the person that I am. How do I deal with my mom? Well, I don't know. Maybe the two of you should go counseling, And then your mom has to tell the husband, well, my father is not feeling well about the person I've become. What do I do with that? I don't really know. Instead of going through all that stuff, I think the best thing to do is first to figure out, well, what the hell does it mean to be human in the first place, with all the complexities. And once you understand some of the basic aspects of what it means to be a human being in a place where things are always changing and moving rather rapidly, once you figure that out, then you can kind of go back to the small questions because you have some insights about the big stuff of life. So, okay, you come out and you're gay. Well, that's great for you. Well, how do you now stay in a relationship in a healthy way? How many men or women do you have to go through until you figure things out? So you've come out. That's not bad. But you come out because now you want to be with your own people, your own gender, and that's complicated. I mean, heterosexuals have had difficulties for a long, long time. What makes you think that coming out in a way that society doesn't approve, that's going to make things easier for you? It's not. Whether you're straight or gay, relationships are complicated. Instead of just paying attention to whether you're this or that, just think about relationships, what they need to survive, what they need to be healthy. Yeah. So if I was to walk in the classroom and a student would say, well, I'm white and I want to walk into a black community, how should I be? So why the hell would you want to go there? For what? I mean, you're curious, well, go. If something happens to you, that happens to you. I don't have the answer to that, because for me it's not interesting. When I was in Davis, I had a tennis coach. I used to steal money to pay the coach so I could, because we had no money. And so one day I went to him and I asked him a question about soccer. And he looks at me and he says, are you dumb? I said, what do you mean? I teach tennis. I have never played soccer. You should ask a soccer coach or someone who plays soccer. This is not to be offensive or insulting to anyone. I just don't care about relationships or relationship questions. They're interesting, they're fun, they're entertaining, they're gossip-like, they're tabloid conversation, So someone says, for example, I'm really, really alone. What do I need to do? I don't know. Go find friends. What kind of friends? Well, I don't really know. Because, for me, whether you have someone or don't have someone, if you happen to be a reflective human being, you can't but be alone. Of course, it's nice to have someone in your life. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but it's not something that I want to sit and talk for hours, And different people create different traumas. I think Socrates creates a different trauma inside Plato. And it's a trauma worth having. And it's a trauma worth experiencing because it matures you. It doesn't paralyze you. It may paralyze you in your marriage, but by the time you've met Socrates and you've become intimate with him, you don't really much care about your wife or your husband. And I think that's great. At least in the field that I'm interested, If somebody has another kind of trauma, well, it is great because there are other departments in life where people focus and specialize in that specific kind of trauma. They have all the right language, they have all the right buzzwords, they have all the right medications. I don't really know. I can't be interested in an 18-year-old who comes to me and says, how do I make my essay better? Well, first it takes thinking, then it takes a lot of experience, then it takes sitting and processing experience. And you're 19, you have no life experience. You can't write a good essay in a meaningful way. Ask me this question when you're like 50. And it's nice when the kid turns 50 because I'll be dead by then. So I don't really have to answer that question. I shared this with you some time ago as well, which was my parents just one day put us on a plane and sent us to India. And then we went back home, visited with them, and then 2 weeks later they shipped us to America. I have no doubt that if I was hanging around people who would tell me that my parents did all of this because they disliked my brother and I think I'd be in therapy right now, 50 years later. I want to know why, I was born and then abandoned, why I was disliked, why I was unloved, But, thankfully, I didn't have any of those poisonous people around me, So your parents sent us to India. Well, good for you. Your parents are good people. It was finished. And add to the fact that we're talking about like almost 6 years ago, Lula. My father belted us once in a while, slapped us once in a while. It wasn't just my father, my mom too. It wasn't just them, my neighbor too, the shop owner too. I'm not joking. It was a common thing that if you cross lines, especially with the elders of your community, they would have no problem slapping, spanking you. And there is no Judge Judy. You can't sue anyone. You can't take anyone to court. You can't go to the police, over there in the street and say, this guy hit me, because the cop will hit you as well. You're like a 5-year-old kid and your mouth is filthy. You're going to get slapped left and right. Here the story is very different. So yeah. I think if you happen to be, in France, about 200 years ago, when they had dominated certain parts of Africa, one of the ways the white French would celebrate their victory was to put a dynamite in the pockets of young black Africans and then have them explode, and then they would celebrate. Once in a while, they would behead a black African, empty the skull, and pour soup in it and drink soup from their skull. Now, if you happen to be French, a white French, and you know these stories, and if you happen to be around Africans who also know their history well, I think as a white French man or woman, you should make sure that you use proper language, proper etiquette, that you don't remind people of the history that they have suffered. That's the way you take care of the traumas that exist in society. When Islam came to Iran, they killed a lot of people. The country belongs to Persians, but they can't walk the streets. That's traumatic. And yet the culture overcame it. People from England migrate to US, to America. Somehow they overcame the loss of their own country. But you need to have a lot of power to overcome anything in life. If you don't have power, you remain weak. Trauma or no trauma. To survive, you need power. You know. And I guess when someone goes to therapy, they go to therapy for this particular reason. Once you have some insights about your interior, you have power.